The fire hose of news from America can feel like a lot these days.
If you're trying to figure out what to make of it all, we got you.
I'm Katie Simpson.
And I'm Paul Hunter. We're correspondents here in Washington,
working just around the corner from where much of the action is taking place.
2 blocks from the White House.
And that's the name of our new podcast.
For top-notch analysis of U.S. politics from a Canadian perspective, find 2 blocks from the White House every Wednesday wherever you get your podcasts.
Including YouTube.
Frequency Podcast Network. Stories that matter, podcasts that resonate.
The federal government has unveiled its long-promised national auto strategy aiming to support Canadian-based manufacturing by turning this country into a global leader in electric vehicles. It comes at a time when Donald Trump's tariffs have put immense pressure on the industry, leading to 2 of the big 3 Detroit-based automakers to either cut back production or move it south of the border.
We're aligning ourselves with Europe. It's a first. We've never done that, but we think that it is important.
I'm Caryn Ceolin, and on the day the strategy came out, I spoke with Federal Industry Minister Mélanie Joly about moving in the opposite direction as the U.S. And today on The Big Story, I'm joined by President of the Canadian Vehicle Manufacturers Association, Brian Kingston, for perspective. He represents North America's big 3 automakers and tells me for the auto industry, much will depend on the details. Brian, thanks so much for making the time for this conversation. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me on.
I have yet to find an industry stakeholder who's not in favor of the government's new auto strategy. Can you explain why that may be?
Yeah, I think it really comes down to one of the key elements of the automotive strategy, which is the repeal of the federal EV mandate. Virtually everybody in the automotive industry, from dealers through to manufacturers, was opposed to that mandate when the government developed it and then when it came into force, because it was so damaging for the automotive industry. On top of that, consumers and Canadians were starting to become aware of how much of a problem this mandate was going to become. Canadians are interested in electrification, but they do not want to be forced into an EV. So you saw widespread support from industry, with the government announcing that they're going to repeal it. But I think what really made the announcement so positive is the fact that they paired the repeal of the mandate with measures to boost EV demand. And this has been the message that we've been delivering to government for years. You don't have a supply problem here. We've got 115 models in market in every size and segment. The EVs are here, and you can go to a dealership anywhere and you will find really compelling electric vehicles to buy. The problem is the demand hasn't been there. Canadians are concerned about the price, and they're concerned about a lack of charging infrastructure. So by getting rid of the mandate, but then also announcing that we want people to electrify and we're going to give you some carrots to help make this happen, it was the right combination of policies at the right time.
I do have a number of questions about different aspects of the new policy, but let's start with the first thing you mentioned, and that's the new system emphasizing, fuel efficiency in place of the EV sales mandate. The automakers you represent in this country, the Detroit 3, they in the U.S. have lobbied Congress and the White House for significant relief from California's emission standards, for instance. President Trump has been clear he does not want cars sold in the U.S. to be made in Canada. Our emission standards, to my understanding, were largely considered stringent already. So why put something in place, do you think, that the White House has already significantly weakened if the goal is to keep manufacturing here in Canada?
Yeah, well, we already had emission standards in place. That has always been the backbone of the government's approach to regulating vehicle emissions and ultimately achieving climate goals. So all that the government's done is they've said, look, we're not going to regulate you twice with an EV mandate on top of emission standards. We're going to use this proven tool to bring down vehicle emissions further and continue us on this path to electrification. Now, what's changed is that typically Canada has aligned its emissions regs to the United States. The reason for that is simple. We don't have a Canadian auto industry. It's a North American auto industry. We're completely integrated with the U.S. But because of the President Trump moves with respect to climate change and GHG regulations, the Americans are going in the opposite direction. So that position of alignment with the U.S. became untenable because of what our government wants to achieve in terms of its climate goals. So we're now in a position where EV mandate's gone, but we're going to use the emissions regs to continue to drive efficiency in automotive. And the reason auto likes that is because, first of all, it's proven to work. It works. If you look at the track record since 2011, we've seen passenger car efficiency increase by 50% and trucks by 30%. So these regs are good. But secondly, it allows more flexibility. You're not telling manufacturers, you must sell X number of EVs or else. You're telling them, here's the emissions goal, technology agnostic. We don't care how you get there, just get there. So that's hydrogen, electric, plug-in hybrid, and efficient gas-powered vehicles. So it's, by virtually every measure, it is a far better policy.
I certainly take your point on all of that, and especially that, we're not going to double regulate them, but they are making those standards tougher. And there's no way, by the government's own estimates, to meet those tougher emission standards without significant EV adoption. Are you confident that the big three here in Canada will be able to adapt then to these new emission standards?
It's all going to depend on how they design them and how quickly the efficiency ramps up in the standard. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done between now and then. That said, Ford, General Motors, and Stellantis are leaders in electrification in Canada. People tend to think of Tesla, for example, which had been the market leader. But last year, 38% of EV sales came from Ford, GM, and Stellantis. General Motors, in fact, is the EV leader in Canada. So yes, they're well positioned. Actually, they're better positioned than any other manufacturer in the Canadian market because of the number of electrified vehicles that they have on offer and what they've got in terms of future plans. That said, and this caveat applies to emission standards just as much as it did to the EV mandate, if you set targets that far exceed where the market is and where the consumer is, you can't meet them. You can't force people to buy an EV. We have been trying to promote electrification as much as possible, but some Canadians, 30% of our population is in rural areas, many Canadians in northern communities, they live in places where an EV is simply not feasible. So I'm very encouraged by the government moving off this idea of 100%. It's not going to fly in Canada. You're not going to get 100% electrification, but you can get to very high levels for the majority of Canadians. So this is definitely the right approach, but we do need to work through the specifics of how quickly they're going to tighten those standards, and they have to pair it with the demand side measures, which they've announced. Now we need to see the impact on the market.
Even though it's not, any longer a 100% mandate for vehicles to be EVs by a certain point, the government is still staking Canada's auto future in EVs. And you would know better than anyone else what's happened at GM in Ingersoll or Stellantis in Brampton. After billions of dollars, taxpayer dollars, were poured into those plants because EVs were supposed to be the future. I suppose, why do you believe the government now, or why should we believe what the government is promising this time will actually produce those results?
Well, there's no doubt that electrification remains the future, and industry believes that, government believes that. What has changed is the timeline. I think it's safe to say that we got a little bit ahead of ourselves in thinking about how quickly this could happen. And then, of course, the Trump administration. The North American market is driven by the United States. And when the Trump administration came in and pulled out all of the supports that were in place for electrification, think back to President Biden's Inflation Reduction Act, huge incentives for electrification, that has slowed the progress. But if you look globally, we know that electrification is the future. It's happening faster in other markets. So we are going to get there, and the government sees that. And one really important point, the reason why electrification was so compelling for Canada was not just because we have an auto industry and a skilled workforce. Those are all good things. But we also happen to sit on every single mineral that goes into a next generation electric vehicle battery at a time when the United States is trying to pivot away from China and its dependency on Chinese rare earth and critical mineral exports. There is no better country in the world to be that supplier of choice. And that was the whole pitch that we were making. Make Canada the center of a new North American EV supply chain. I still think that's a very compelling direction for Canada to go if we can speed up our mining and approval processes, which the government has indicated they want to do. And if we can continue to make investments into processing, battery plants and protect our manufacturing sector. So that is all still there, but it's going to take a little bit longer.
Do you think aligning Canada with a shift to EVs, a shift that, as you mentioned, is well underway in other parts of the world, in Europe and in China, do you think that poses a danger at all for the U.S. automakers in Canada who you represent, or is that, like, am I overstating things here?
No, I don't think so. I mean, given that the leaders in EV sales, the shift to electrification benefits them because they are selling the most volume of EVs in Canada. I think if there's any risk, it's just, again, that you can't move the regulations faster than the market. And that will be the fine line that the government needs to walk. We want Canadians to come along with us on this journey to electrification. We don't want to force them into it before they are ready. And so the key there is really the charging infrastructure piece. If you don't live in a standalone home with a driveway, you are in a very difficult position to move to an EV because depending on public or on-street charging is simply not convenient. It's just a fact. But we can address that. So if we do that now, I think it positions us well. But we've got a lot of work to do. And these are barriers that have been identified for years. And frankly, we've made very little progress.
I spoke with Industry Minister Mélanie Joly about the new auto strategy, and she struck a bit of a different tone than the one that you're striking today.
At the core of this strategy is really to attract new automakers to Canada. The Japanese automakers have been the ones that are actually invested very much in the country. Even since the trade war started, they've increased their production. Imagine that. Of course, we will invest in those who invest in us. If the D3 are reducing their footprint in Canada, we're taking stock of that.
Does that alarm you at all that the government appears to be pulling away from the big three?
Yeah, well, and look, it's just based on a complete misunderstanding of the industry. If you look at the history of auto in Canada, Ford, GM, and Stellantis have been here for 100 years. In one case, one of them has been here for 120 years. The footprint of the D3 is far larger than what the Japanese do here. The Japanese currently produce more vehicles, but they don't have nearly the supply chain that the D3 have. So multiple assembly plants, R&D and innovation centers, battery supply chain partners. The footprint is much larger, 20,000 employees, far exceeding what the Japanese employ. And most of that, of course, is unionized. So trying to pivot away from the D3, who built 100 million cars in Canada, would be a huge mistake. And frankly, attracting investment into this market that isn't linked to the United States is never going to happen. To build a plant in Canada, you need to build about 200,000 cars a year. Our market is simply not big enough to sustain any more automotive plants if you can't export to the US. So that has to be the priority. I understand the government wants to pivot away and try and diversify, but geography is destiny. We're never diversifying away from the United States or the Detroit Three.
I guess her point was that
this year, 77% of all the cars produced in the country are done by Honda and Toyota. In 40 years, they haven't done one major layoff. In the 80s, when the D3 were cutting jobs and closing plants across the country, what did the government at the time did? It was the Brian Mulroney's Conservatives. They decided to go to Japanese automakers, and they made sure that Japanese automakers were investing in Canada. 40 years later, where are we? They're 77% of our production. So we think we have to invest in them, and at the same time, we're allowing new players to come in.
What message do you think this sends to those workers at those plants where production is heavily focused on internal combustion engines?
Yeah, well, I worry that there's a lack of understanding about the fact that a unionized workforce is very different than a non-unionized workforce. You don't have that immediate flexibility with your employee base when you make a change at a plant. You've got long-term commitments to these employees. So comparing decisions made at Japanese manufacturers to a unionized workforce it's like apples and oranges. It's completely different. And I also worry about some of the rhetoric sounds like it's a shift away from these manufacturers who've been here for such a long time and employ so many Canadians. We need to support these companies. We need to protect the footprint that we have and then build from there. taking a more negative approach to them will be very damaging for communities that depend on auto. I invite the government to go and walk around a plant at Windsor Assembly. Look at the impact that plant has on the community. There's no pivoting away from that plant. You can't simply replace it and say, oh, we'll just retrain workers. No, that would be devastating for this community. So we've got to find a way to address the U.S. issue and then ultimately help this industry continue to grow and thrive. They want to work with the government to try and find a solution here. We all have the same ultimate objective in mind, which is protecting this footprint and growing it. And so I think with the EV mandate removed, that was a huge irritant to manufacturing here in this country. We can now focus on that one core mission. How do we protect the sector and how do we eliminate tariffs and ultimately make sure that this industry employs more Canadians, not less? So I think we're in a good spot, but we've just got to get those discussions moving and ultimately try and find a path forward with the United States.
I wanted to get your insight on the changes that will be coming to the remission structure. My understanding is the government is looking at changing that remission structure to allow for additional credits that to automakers that make cars in Canada. Can you just kind of explain that structural change? Just help us understand, how this might help the industry or not in your assessment.
Yeah, so the way this was initially designed, it was a response to the U.S. tariffs. So the United States put 25% tariffs on Canada. And so then Canada responded with our own retaliatory tariffs. Now, because we were hoping that this would be a short-term situation, the government had indicated they were going to negotiate away these tariffs with the Americans by the summer of 2025. Here we are into 2026 with no progress to date. So now it's become a more permanent situation. So what the government's looking at doing is how do you structure a framework that ultimately tries to reward companies that manufacture here by giving them relief on Canadian tariffs. So right now, if you import a car from the United States, you pay a 25% tariff. I'm simplifying, but that's the general way it works. If you build in this country, you are given remissions because you have that footprint, that commitment to Canada. You don't have to pay that tariff bringing that vehicle in from the U.S. If the government wants to pursue this policy to the fullest extent, then they would have to tariff all vehicles coming into Canada. So if you bring a car in from Tokyo, from Japan, from South Korea, anywhere in Europe, you're tariffed unless you have some sort of investment in Canada. So I don't know if they're going to go that far, but that is ultimately, if you're going to try and create this protected Canadian market, that investment is the only way to access, that's how you would have to pursue this. Now, there are many questions about a policy like that, of course, because, well, Canada has trade agreements with Japan. We have trade agreements with the European Union. Are we going to contravene those? And the other question is, would companies come here for a 2 million sales per year market? This is a big market and it's a good market, but 2 million is not enough to justify multiple assembly plants. It just simply doesn't work that way. So there's some real questions around how you could design it in a way that will actually bring investment into Canada if the government's assuming they never get a deal with the United States.
Unifor's National President Lana Payne, whom I know you're well acquainted with, she mentioned in her statement that the changes coming to the remission structure, and I'm paraphrasing here, had the possibility to bring back jobs to this country. Do you share in that assessment? Is it enough, for instance, to bring Jeep Compass production in Brampton back?
The only thing that brings jobs back is getting rid of U.S. tariffs and renewing our trade agreement. I mean, that's just the fact of how this industry works. If we do not have access to the U.S., the auto industry will not be the size it is today. That's just the basis of how an auto plant works. Like, just to give you a sense here, automotive is a very low margin but high volume industry. Your margins at a plant are pretty thin. So you have to produce a huge number of vehicles. We're very lucky to have 5 OEMs that build here, but 90%, sometimes 92% of their production is going to the United States. So if we're in a world in which the government has given up and they say, we can't negotiate a deal with the Americans, we're just going to accept that we're going to disentangle our supply chains. We're not allowing American cars into Canada. We're not going to send Canadian cars to the US. Then we're talking about a 2 million vehicle sales per year market and what you could attract here to service that. That's at most 3-4 assembly plants, less than what we currently have, significantly. So unfortunately, I don't think a remissions program is going to put us in a position to attract new investment. It might allow us to hang on to what we have, but we better focus our efforts on what really matters, and that's the U.S. relationship.
Let me ask you very quickly as well about creating that demand again, because that's something you also spoke about earlier, the government restoring these consumer rebates for EV purchases. Hoping to get your take on what the Conservatives argue, and they're saying essentially that the predominant beneficiary will be the American companies that produce the EVs we buy. Yes or no?
Look, we're in a tough spot because you want to increase EV sales, but you also want to favor Canadian production and the Canadian supply chain. The reality is we do not have major EV production yet in Canada. There's only 2 models that will benefit from these new incentives. So, the government has to make a hard choice. Like, do you want to boost EV demand to ultimately achieve your climate objectives, or are you going to focus solely on your industrial policy? If you're going to go down the industrial road, well, then you wouldn't have introduced any incentives at all, or you would have geared them purely to Canadian produced vehicles. But then, of course, you're not going to see a big bump in terms of EV sales. So the government's in a difficult position on this. The thing that they did absolutely right is they kept Chinese EVs out. That would have been an absolute disaster to both allow them in and then to subsidize them. But, the fact is that most of the production of the vehicles that people want is coming out of the US and Mexico. So until we build out our own supply chain, that's just a reality.
Just lastly, what would be your main takeaway, or what do you think the main takeaway should be for Canadians who are looking at this new strategy and trying to make sense of it?
I think they should look at it through the lens of the electrification piece and what it means for their potential next vehicle purchase. We want more Canadians to switch to electric. We need to build more charging infrastructure, and I think this strategy helps. They put, with the incentive in particular, there's a long time frame on it. So this should help spur more people to rethink that purchasing decision and decide whether or not they're ready to move to electric. So that was my big takeaway, outside of obviously getting rid of the EV mandate. But I don't know if Canadians will be as familiar as they will be with the direct demand-focused measures that will impact them.
Brian Kingston, a pleasure to get your insight on this. Thanks so much for making the time.
Thanks for having me.
And that was The Big Story. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this conversation. Send us an email at hello@thebigstorypodcast.ca. Reach us on Instagram @frequencypods or on Blue Sky @thebigstory. If you know someone who might enjoy this episode, be sure to send it to them. You can listen to The Big Story every day on the Seeker app or wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Caryn Ceolin. Thanks so much for listening.